Night Law is a 1984 action-adventure game by Ultimate Play, the game known for popularizing isometric graphics in video games. It was written by company founders Chris and Tim Stamper in their Sabreman series. In Night Law, the player character Sabreman has 40 days to collect objects throughout a castle and brew a cure to his werewolf curse. Each castle room is depicted in monochrome on its own screen and consists of blocks to climb, obstacles to avoid, and puzzles to solve. The game used a novel image masking technique, copyrighted as Filmation, in which images, such as the main character, could overlap other images without visual collision. This created the illusion of depth priority in on-screen images, which the computer hardware did not naturally support. Night Law was released third in the Sabreman series despite being the first completed. Ultimate anticipated Night Law to change the market and chose to withhold its release to protect the sales of its upcoming Saber Wolf and to preempt Night Law clones by releasing a second Filmation game. Ultimate released Night Law shortly after its first two Sabreman titles in November 1984 for the ZX Spectrum. Ports followed for the BBC Micro, Amstrad CPC, MSX, and Famicom Disk System. The game was later included in compilations including Rare's 2015 Xbox One retrospective compilation, Rare Replay. Night Law is regarded as a seminal work in British gaming history and has been included in multiple lists of top Spectrum games. Critics considered its technical solutions and isometric 3D style a harbinger of future game design. They praised the game's controls and atmosphere of mystery, but noted its gameplay difficulty, and criticized its sound and occasional graphical slowdown. Night Law was the best-selling game of January 1985 and was named 1984 Game of the Year by the Golden Joystick Awards and Popular Computing Weekly. Readers. Though it was not the first isometric 3D video game, Night Law popularized the format. And when the isometric, flick-screen style fell out of fashion, Night Law's influence persisted in computer role-playing games. Retrospective reviewers remember the game as the first to offer an exploratory world rather than a flat surface, but found its controls outdated and frustrating in the 30 years since its release. Gameplay. The player, as Sabreman, has been bitten by the Saber Wolf and now transforms into a werewolf at nightfall. He has 40 days to collect items throughout a strange castle and brew a cure for his curse. An on-screen timer shows the progression of day into night when Sabreman changes to a werewolf, returning to human form at sunrise. Some of the castle's monsters only attack Sabreman when he is a werewolf. The game ends if the player does not finish the cure in 40 days. The game's only directions are given through a poem included with the game's cassette tape. The castle consists of a series of 128 rooms, each displayed on a single, non-scrolling screen. Sabreman must navigate the 3D maze of stone blocks in each room, usually to retrieve a collectible object, whilst avoiding spikes and enemies which kill him on contact. The player begins with 4 lives, and loses 1 for each death. Running out of lives ends the game. Stone blocks serve as platforms for the player to jump between. Some fall under the player's weight, some move of their own accord, and some can be pushed by ghosts. Sabreman jumps higher when in werewolf form, which helps in specific puzzles. The player often needs to move bricks to reach objects out of reach, which may be used to solve puzzles elsewhere. To complete the game, the player must return 14 objects in a specific order from throughout the castle to a cauldron room in its center staffed by the wizard Melchior. At the end of the game, the player receives a final score based on the remaining time and amount of the quest completed, though the game does not support a leaderboard. Development. Ultimate Play, the game, represented by its co-founding Stamper brothers, was infamously taciturn in matters of press and marketing, though they provided some details on Night Law's development to Crash. While Night Law was released as the third game in the Sabreman series, the Stamper brothers had finished it first. They withheld the game for about a year for market reasons. They thought that Night Law's advancements, copyrighted as the Filmation engine, would hurt sales of their upcoming Saber Wolf. The Stampers used the extra time to prepare another Filmation game so as to preempt the publishers that would rush to copy the technique. We just had to sit on it because everyone else was so far behind, Tim Stamper recalled. Saber Wolf released to commercial and critical success in 1984. Alien 8 and the next two Sabreman titles, Underworlder and Night Law, followed in close succession before the end of the year. Filmation and Night Law's graphical novelty lay in how images could render without overlapping. Filmation introduced masked sprites, whereas earlier games used planar sprites, which overlapped without regard for depth order. Chris Stamper's solution was to use image masking. A mask is a version of an image that defines a background from the subject matter in different colors. When combining the mask and the on-screen composite image, the mask's background data was ignored and a hole in the shape of the desired image sprite was added to the background. This was filled in with the sprite's details. Thus, rooms in Night Law were drawn one sprite at a time through this masking method. In more recent times, contemporary images render with layer priority set at the individual pixel level. Night Law is depicted in a single color that changes between rooms, so as to avoid attribute clash, a computing limitation wherein one sprite's color bled into another. Ultimate released Night Law for the ZX Spectrum in November 1984. In a press release, they announced the game as the beginning of a new class of adventure games and the very pinnacle of software development on the 48K Spectrum. Ultimate did not circulate screenshots of the game in its press materials or cover art. Night Law was later released for the BBC Micro, Amstrad CPC, and MSX later in 1985. The Amstrad version upgraded the monochromatic coloring to a two-color setup while the MSX release was released through Jaleco. Ultimate asked Shahid Ahmed, who developed the Night Law-inspired Chimera, to write the Commodore 64 port. In 1986, the Famicom Disk System release of Night Law bore little resemblance to its namesake. Night Law game later appeared in the Spectrum version of the 1986 compilation They Sold a Million To and the 2015 Xbox One compilation of 30 Ultimate and Rare titles. Rare replay reception. Computer game magazines lauded Night Law, writing that its graphics were the first of its kind and marked a sea change from its contemporaries. Computer and Video Games wrote that they had never seen graphics of its caliber and that it lived up to Ultimate's hype. Peter Swayze of Home Computing Weekly was left speechless and predicted that Night Law would change the market. Crash called it the Spectrum's best game and said it was unlikely to be improved. Crash selected Night Law as a Crash Smash recommendation in its January 1985 issue. Night Law was the best-selling game in the United Kingdom that month. Popular Computing Weekly readers named Night Law their 1984 arcade game and overall Game of the Year. Night Law was also named CVG's Game of the Year at their 1985 Golden Joystick Awards event, and Ultimate was named both Developer and Programmer of the Year. In 1985, Crash compared Night Law stylistically to the 1984 Avalon, but suggested that the former had bolder visuals. They noted how Night Law's masking technique addressed issues of flicker and attribute clash, and how the game's novel 8-way direction scheme suited the 3D space. Their reviewer preferred to play as a werewolf and noted the cruel difficulty of some rooms. They appreciated the imaginative mystery of the game as they attempted to answer why Sabreman turns into a werewolf and what the collectible objects throughout the castle do. Crash preferred Night Law to Underworlder, its predecessor. One reviewer wrote that the former was Ultimate's best game. Sinclair user S. Chris Bourne liked how Sabreman disappeared when passing behind blocks. They described Night Law's atmosphere as a crepuscular world of claustrophobic menace that inspired many curious questions on the part of the adventurer. CVG found the werewolf transformation sequence annoying, and Your Spectrum found the game particularly difficult. Reviewers found the game's sound its weakest component. In Amstrad reviews, Amtix noted the color additions over the monochromatic original and wrote that Night Law was among the Amstrad's best adventures. Their one complaint was the graphical slowdown when too many elements were moving on screen. Amstrad Action shared this complaint, but nevertheless named Night Law the Amstrad's among of the best 3 games on the console, both as an improvement on the Spectrum release and on par with the quality of Commodore 64 titles. In a retrospective review, Kieran Gillen of Rock, Paper, Shotgun recalled that, though isometric games had existed previously, Night Law was the first game to offer a world with physical depth for exploration as opposed to the simple mechanics of arcade games. Jeremy Senior of Used Gamer agreed that Night Law felt more like a world than a painting, and added that the game's innovative use of successive, single-screen rooms predated The Legend of Zelda by years. Gillen said the game's punishing style had become obsolete in the 30 years since its release, and criticized Night Law as enormously innovative, incredibly atmospheric, and totally unplayable, suggesting that the similar head-over-heels had aged much better. Peter Parrish, too, found the game frustrating, though well-made. Dan Whitehead of the same publication appreciated that the 2015 Rare Replay compilation emulated Night Law in choppy animations similar to how the original ZX Spectrum's processor once struggled to render the on-screen objects. Legacy. Night Law is widely regarded as a seminal work in British gaming history. According to Gillen, Night Law is second only to Elite as an icon of 1980s gaming. Retro Gamer wrote that first impressions of Night Law were unforgettable, comparable to the experience of playing Space Harrier, Wolfenstein 3D, and Super Mario 64 for the first time. Night Law was not the first to use isometric graphics. Earlier examples include Zaxxon, Q*Bert, and Ant Attack, but it popularized the style and put Ultimate and Filmation in its epicenter. Several video game clones were inspired by Night Law. When Edge Games struggled to approximate the isometric style internally, the visiting developer Bojang Aborg devised his own solution, which led to Fairlight, itself regarded as a classic. Edge's version of Filmation received its own branding as World Maker. Shahid Ahmed and Firebird's Chimera was even closer to Night Law. Ahmed's shock and admiration from playing the precursor both changed his life and convinced him to continue making games. He released Chimera on the Amstrad CPC, Atari, Commodore 64, and ZX Spectrum, customizing each port for the processing limitations of its platform. By 1986, many video game publishers had produced Night Law-style isometric games. Examples include Swevo's World, Movie, Quasitron, Get Dexter, Glider Rider, and Molecule Man. Many of these titles suffered the same slowdown issues as Night Law due to too much on-screen activity. Ultimate itself released 4 additional Filmation games. Alien 8 was rushed for release before developers had an opportunity to react to Night Law, though Retro Gamer said that its rush did not show behind a larger game world with more puzzles. Alien 8 and Night Law are similar in gameplay, but the former is set in outer space. With the updated Filmation 2 engine, Nightshade added color and scrolling graphics, but Retro Gamer said that its gameplay was comparatively dull. Gunfight, reported as the Stamper's last game, also used Filmation 2 and was more robust than its predecessor. Pentagram returned to flip-screen rooms and its action-based gameplay included shooting enemies. It sold poorly and was the last Sabreman game. Meanwhile, the Stamper brothers sought to enter the nascent console industry in the wake of rampant computer game piracy in the United Kingdom. They sold Ultimate to U.S. gold in the mid-1980s and began Rare to develop Nintendo console games. Ultimate's last two isometric games were poorly executed, but consumer interest in the genre endured. The isometric, flip-screen trend continued for several years. Apart from Fairlight, Swevo's World and Get Dexter, there was the John Rittman's Night Law-inspired Batman, 1987's Head Over Heels, The Last Ninja, La Rabardia del Crimine, the 1990 Cadaver and console games Solstice and Landstalker. As players tired of the genre's similar reiterations, Rittman's games, in particular, brought new ideas. Sandy White of the pre-Night Law isometric game Ant Attack was impressed at Ultimate's in-game balance and gutsy design decisions. The developer of The Great Escape, another isometric game, considered Night Law to be more a rival title than an inspiration. But it still spurred him to spend 9 months making Where Time Stood Still. Retro Gamer wrote that Night Law's influence persisted 30 years later through titles like Populous, Syndicate, UFO, Enemy Unknown, and Civilization II. The style also spread to computer role-playing games like Baldur's Gate, Planescape, Torment, Diablo, and Fallout. Though GamesRadar's Matt Cundy reported in 2009 that isometric perspective was no longer as prominent a topic in game design, in 2014, Chris Scullion of Vice traced Night Law's isometric influence to The Sims 4 and Diablo 3. Night Law was included in multiple lists of top Spectrum games. It inspired fan games including Peter Hanratty's 1999 fan sequel and 2010 3D remake of the original, which was in development for 4 years.